So this is the one in which 2 years later, we reflect on an insurrection, on how our most important civic tradition was broken, and on how responsibility for both of these things belongs to Donald Trump individually and the Republican Party collectively. So it's the 2-year anniversary of January 6th and the insurrection. And obviously, mainstream and social media are going to be covering this event and all its constituent facts and pieces of trivia nonstop. And understandably and justifiably so. It's a big frickin' deal. Obviously, the day itself has very little minute-by-minute or hour-by-hour relevance to most Americans throughout their daily lives, right? People are focused on, growing and raising families, finding love, maintaining relationships, maintaining healthy habits, dealing with inflation, dealing with wage gaps, dealing with all these things, dealing with COVID. But the fact of the matter is, as a society, as a nation, January 6th was hella important, whether conservatives want to acknowledge it or not. But I don't want to get into, again, the pieces of trivia or the constituent facts about January 6th, because, again, other analysts are going to do that. People are going to be citing the House January 6th Select Committee's final report, which was between 814 or 845 pages. It has all of the information, from one page all the way down, all the citations, all the evidence. It's all collated. It's all, put in a very digestible, comprehensive way. But we're not doing a book review about that, though I do want to talk about a book briefly. Basically, this video is about January 6th and more importantly, how it relates to George Washington, the peaceful transfer of power, and how Donald Trump individually and the GOP collectively, I don't even want to say disrespected because that's too mild of a term, but they disgraced both Washington, as an idea of a man and what he represented to this country, and one of the traditions that he started, which is the peaceful transfer of power, which I would argue, and I think many historians would argue, is probably the single most important civic or government-related tradition that we have, okay? So first things first, I do want to kind of hawk a book here, right? So typically I'm a fiction connoisseur. I love, good prose. I love fantasy, science fiction. I even love John Green, right? So even like well-written young adult, just general fiction, right? It's all about the prose, characterization, and dialogue and tone and things like that. But over the years, I've gotten into certain types of nonfiction as long as they're well-written, typically about, political and military and social leaders. And I read one recently, this one here, called You Never Forget Your First by Alexis Coe. And the title's spicy, obviously. It's incendiary. It's meant to be a bit controversial, but it's not about losing your virginity, right? It's not a pamphlet for those of you incels watching right now on how to get laid. It's actually about how the great George Washington popped the United States of America's cherry, as ridiculous as that sounds. It's a really good biography that dives into Washington's life and his military career and his civic career and his time as president. And it doesn't seek to demonize him by any stretch. It recognizes his greatness. It recognizes his importance. But it doesn't try to sanctify or beatify him either, right? It covers his various failures as a president, right? Because he wasn't perfect. He made administrative failures. He made political failures. He made military mistakes when he was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, right? He wasn't this, brilliant military tactician. He was a really good strategist, right? So that it enabled him to defeat the British with large help from the French. And also his moral failures, right? So, there's this effort by conservatives to sanitize the founding fathers as being these not just relatively progressive men, but even by today's standards, just these noble, divine people, like who actually had a really progressive view about slavery. Well, the fact of the matter is that while we do have evidence that George Washington had misgivings about slavery, the fact of the matter is he was a slave owner, right? And he may not have morally enjoyed it, right? It wasn't necessarily out of sadism, not necessarily something out of like the book or the movie 12 Years a Slave, but he knowingly enslaved people for cynical purposes to maintain Mount Vernon, and he didn't want to pay them. Now, he would argue He couldn't have paid them even if he wanted to, but the fact of the matter is he knowingly enslaved people, and this book doesn't gloss over it. So it's a really cool, really well-written book about the most important person in our nation's history. And one of the things, it's not only is the timing interesting because I read it recently, but thinking about January 6th, so much of this ties back to Washington's influence over us. I mean, his influence can't be overstated, right? We've named the federal capital after him. The term Washington is a metonym, right? It refers to, the locus of American power, just like how Moscow is. Like when reports say, Moscow says, Moscow announces, they're not referring to the city. They're referring to the fact that it's a nexus for a country's power. And for us, it's Washington. It's named after him, right? And so much of who we are today as a country owes a great deal to Washington. And so much of what the presidency is as an institution owes to Washington, right? Like, piece of trivia that people often forget is that the two presidential terms that was observed until FDR, that was never a law until after FDR ran and was elected for 3 or 4 terms. It was just a tradition that Washington set. And every president between Washington and FDR observed that tradition. That's how much power this man's legacy has with civic leaders in this country. But the single biggest one wasn't just the 2 terms, right? It was the peaceful transfer of power. And this book talks about how, Washington committed to a peaceful transfer of power twice. First was when he was commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. After he defeated the British, there's evidence to suggest that his officers and his troops would have supported Washington and perhaps would have preferred Washington to overthrow the Continental Congress and declare himself the king or emperor of the 13 colonies. And instead of doing that, he resigned his commission, right? He went in and handed back absolute power to the Continental Congress, which, by the way, didn't have any sort of alternate army or alternate armed forces or security apparatus to fight Washington. Washington had them by the short and curlies. And instead of seizing power for himself like most people would, like Donald Trump would, he gave it back. And even with all due respect to the great President Lincoln, but the fact of the matter is that while Lincoln prosecuted the Civil War, he understandably accrued executive power unto himself. So I don't know if any president would have done what Washington did if given the opportunity. But he did it then, and then he did it after his second term. He didn't want to run for president in the first place, and he certainly didn't want to run a second time, but he was persuaded to. And he's the only president in history to win unanimous electoral votes in the Electoral College, I think both times. But after the second term, finally, he was like, okay, you all talked me into this crap, running for president, running this country twice. I'm not doing it a third time. And he committed to a peaceful transfer of power. He didn't run for a second term. He was prepared to give it up. And then John Adams, who came after Washington, he also honored the peaceful transfer of power when he lost his reelection bid to Thomas Jefferson. He followed Washington's example. When he didn't get his second term and he was beaten by his political opponent, Thomas Jefferson, he gave power over willingly. And then, from then on out, that peaceful transfer of power stretched all throughout the decades, all throughout the centuries. Whig, Federalist, Anti-Federalist, blah, 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 Republican, Democrat, all the way to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump broke it. Donald Trump shattered the most important and oldest civic tradition in this country, the peaceful transfer of executive power. It's huge, right? See, we throw around terms like President of the United States. I listen to Destiny a lot, and Destiny often will appeal to the title of the President of the United States. When he talks about the danger of what Trump did during January 6th and spreading the big lie. Trump was the President of the United States. Trump was the President of the United States. Sometimes I think we take that title for granted. Let's think about what the President of the United States is. The most powerful man in the world, the most powerful person in the world, certainly the most powerful person in this country, the head of state, the head of government, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the mightiest military force on the planet, right? There is no one in this country who is vested with more power as an individual legally, militarily, culturally, like when you consider the bully pulpit, the influence of the president, there is no person vested with so much power as the sitting president of the United States. There is no congressperson. There is no senator. There is no cabinet member. There's no state governor. There's nobody as an individual who comes close. As a matter of fact, according to many constitutional scholars, the president is a branch unto himself. We have 3 branches of government, and the first branch, the legislative branch, that power is split. 435 voting members of the House of Representatives, 100 voting members of the Senate. It's collectively 538. It's where the website comes from. It's where it gets its name. The Supreme Court of the United States, power is shared between 9 justices at the moment. And again, they are reactive. They can't proactively exercise their power. Cases have to be appealed to and taken up by them. But the president is a branch unto himself. That's the kind of power this person wields. That's why they're referred to as the most powerful person in the world. And we used to believe in this country, this notion, or at least we would say we believed in this notion, best summarized by the great philosopher Uncle Ben from Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. And we used to believe that power and responsibility scale. So the more power you have, the more responsibility you have. And that's something that I think most of us acknowledge tacitly, right? Teachers have a lot of power, right? And conservatives are, they're busting teachers all the time. They're just constantly hounding teachers, making all sorts of accusations. Well, if you ask them, they would say, well, the reason we do that is because teachers wield a lot of influence. They have a lot of power, right? Cops, police, law enforcement, they have a lot of power. In many cases, the power of life and death on their hip. So we hold them to a higher standard. With great power comes great responsibility. Who has more power than the President of the United States, Republican or Democrat? Nobody. There is nobody in this country at any given time who should have more scrutiny on them than a sitting president. And by the way, as a staunch Democrat, I feel that way about President Biden. I felt that way about President Obama. If I'd been, old enough to understand what was going on, I would have felt that way about President Clinton. The sitting president, Republican or Democrat, should be held to higher standards than anybody and should be scrutinized more than anybody. But it also has to be a consistent standard, right? We can't just hold Democrat presidents to a higher standard, because that power is also possessed by Republican presidents when they hold the office. So we need to be consistent. We need to be honest. We need to avoid the double standard and hypocrisy. Which brings us to January 6th. The fact of the matter is that as sitting president of the United States, Donald Trump had more responsibility than anybody to prevent January 6th from happening and to stop it the moment that it did. But we know for a fact he sat on his ass, his orange ass, for 3 hours and watched television. And by the way, he wasn't watching Netflix. He was watching footage of January 6th on Fox News. He watched it unfold as people waving flags with his name on it, and also Confederate flags, by the way, broke into the Capitol, assaulted police officers, assaulted Capitol Police, and he just watched it happen. Imagine if a Democratic president had done that. Imagine that it's 2017, January 6, 2017, and then President Obama is watching television as Hillary Clinton supporters, who are pissed off that they lost the election to Donald Trump, break into the Capitol building and threaten then Vice President Joe Biden and Republican and Democratic congresspeople. Imagine how Republicans would have reacted, conservatives would have reacted in mainstream and social media, and just civilians. Imagine what would have happened. Texas would have threatened to secede from the Union. Can you imagine how pissed off Lindsey Graham would be, how pissed off Ted Cruz would be? If you're a conservative, how pissed off you would be? And understandably so, because it would have been a colossal dereliction of duty from the most powerful person in the world, who therefore had the most responsibility in the world. Therefore, if you think you'd probably have been pissed off and outraged and demanded justice and accountability if a Democratic president had done it, then you're obligated to feel the same way about Donald Trump. Donald Trump spat in the face of George Washington and every president between him and George Washington who observed that peaceful transfer of power tradition. He spat in their face. He dishonored the Constitution. He dishonored the founding fathers if they're people that you deify. He dishonored 250 years of this democratic republic. But it's not just Donald Trump, right? See, it's too easy to focus on him. But Trump shouldn't be scapegoated. Trump is, again, individually, the most responsible person and should be held to the highest account. But he was aided and abetted by the Republican Party in general. It wasn't just Trump. Here's a scary statistic people tend to forget. After the insurrection, right, after the Capitol was cleared and members of Congress went back into the Capitol building to certify the results of the election, 147 Republicans voted to overturn the results. They participated in formal objections to then President-elect Biden's victory. After, not before, that would have been bad enough, given that there was no evidence that the election was in any way compromised or illegitimate. After Trump supporters broke into the Capitol and threatened to kill them, and tried to. 147. Now, to put that in perspective, because conservatives and Trump supporters, they love their whataboutisms, 10 Democrats, 10, voted to or attempted to object to then President-elect Trump's victory in 2017. 10. Not 47, not 100, 10. The disparity, the order of magnitude, wildly different. There's no way to effectively both sides this. In a conflict, very rarely are two people equally responsible, equally bad. And in this case, in terms of election denial and things like that, you might try to engage in whataboutism, but the fact of the matter is Republicans are objectively far worse by orders of magnitude. Number one, in January 2017, no Democrat attempted an insurrection. Number two, the people who did object to the results, there were only 10 of them. 10. And number three, the 10 who did object couldn't get anybody in the other chamber, including their other Democratic colleagues, to co-sign the objection, so they were informal. 10 members of the House of Representatives, Democrats, tried to object, and they couldn't get any senator to co-sign. But in January 2021, 147 Republicans managed to co-sign formal objections to Biden's win. The disparity in shamelessness and dishonesty and fanaticism are just orders of magnitude apart. And many of these people are still sitting members of Congress to this day. Many of them won re-election. They're still there. Ted Cruz is still there. Josh Hawley is still there. Right? So what's important to remember is that the Republican Party of 2023, which is hilariously attempting to make Kevin McCarthy Speaker of the House and failing hilariously, for all intents and purposes, that's the same Republican Party of 2 years ago. It's the same Republican Party of January 2021. Most of the faces are still there. Most of the thought leaders are still there. Yeah, Donald Trump isn't president anymore, but he's announced that he's running in 2024, and he may win. He may not. But his influence, how he has poisoned the party and how they've allowed themselves to be poisoned, that's still there. So the fact of the matter is, yes, he is responsible morally and perhaps legally as an individual, and we'll see the results of the Department of Justice investigation, which is looking into him for that now, along with the stolen document stuff in Mar-a-Lago. But morally, the Republican Party collectively is. And so it's too easy to forget that. It's given that there's not minute by minute, hour by hour relevance to the lives of every American, it's easy for us in our day-to-day priorities and our distractions to forget about this. But the GOP has not repented collectively. They've not fallen on the sword collectively. They have not flogged themselves publicly. They have not begged the American public for forgiveness for shattering the single most important civic tradition in our country's history and jeopardizing the health of the republic. The fact of the matter is, in political science, both domestically and internationally, there's this well-founded notion that a failed coup or a failed insurrection is merely dress rehearsal for the next one. Do we really believe that the GOP has found its limiting principle? I've seen no evidence of it. And until I do, I'm holding the GOP collectively morally responsible for January 6th. And so should you. And that's what I'd like you to reflect on today.